away from North Wales to the Outer Hebrides, but for 4 young rock climbers, the journey by Bedford van and 3 ferry crossings has been inspired by a 10-year-old magazine article. The article tells of a rock climb by Paul Lloyd and Terry King up the great scooped face of an enormous Hebridean rock prow called Sròn Ulladal.
Brilliant. They've tried to aid it, they failed to aid that. That's it there. See it, Doug Scott failed to aid that. Yeah.
This most impressive of British mountain crags lies in the far northwest of Scotland on the Isle of Harris. Only 300 miles as the eagle flies, but a 600-mile road and sea trip from North Wales.
Is that Terry's teeth up in there?
Yeah, that's it.
Johnny Dawes, affectionately known in climbing circles as the Cosmic Rascal, is one of Britain's finest rock climbers. He's a flamboyant character who just can't resist entertaining the tourists waiting for the car ferry at Uig on the Isle of Skye. Johnny is something of a maverick among modern climbers, well deserves his other nickname of Stone Monkey. Johnny Dawes came to Sròn Ulladal a year earlier, and his climbing companion then, as now, was Paul Pritchard.
I first visited Harris a year before this trip with Johnny. I instantly fell in love with the Outer Hebrides, and since then I've promised myself an annual trip back. Although it's close to home, Harris has a quite unique atmosphere, and for me it's becoming a good place to escape to once in a while.
Like rats in a cage, success, survival, 2 meters a day. It's Romans 1 facing Satan's dead. But mountains are holy places, and beauty is free. We can still walk through the garden out after Swan's Green. Pull down the forest, we need more wood. Extend the currency, we need more food. Burning our bridges before the flood.
These first views of the crag are the reward for the long walk-in. With Dawes and Pritchard are 2 other young climbers from North Wales, Bob Drury and Crispin Waddy. Those heavy rucksacks are filled with camping gear for a week's stay and enough climbing gear to tackle this great overhanging scoop face of the Sròn.
12, I think.
Despite its remoteness, Sròn Ulladal is well known to British climbers. It was visited and climbed during the years when artificial climbing was in vogue. Using bolts and pitons, the aid climbers, as they were known, would clip étriers, a kind of short rope ladder, into the pegs and then stand up in them, and so make their way up the overhanging cliff. But in recent years, a phenomenal rise in climbing standards and perception has allowed climbers to tackle outrageous routes like this one absolutely free. Paul Pritchard.
Finding our chalk on the holes from last year's ascent to the scoop brought back a lot of memories and shows that this cliff really is like a big umbrella. Down below us, Bobby and Crispin were attempting to free climb an aid route called Sidewinder, but our project this time was to free climb an old aid route called Knucklehead, which shares the same first pitch with the scoop.
In June 1969, Doug Scott, one of Britain's best-known climbers, spent 30 hours spread over several days climbing this great scooped face of Sròn Ulladal. He climbed it almost entirely by artificial means, and it became recognised as the most committing aid climb in the country. To climb it free of this aid, using only the natural features of the rock and the climber's own strength, seemed inconceivable at the time. But the year before this expedition, Dawes and Pritchard did just that. That free ascent of the scoop of Sròn Ulladal was recognised as one of the most visionary pieces of rock climbing since the war.
This pitch felt a lot harder and steeper than I remembered it. Over to the right, the other two were moving much faster than we were. Knucklehead leaves the scoot rightwards here, to a white ledge below a blank overhanging wall. This is what we come to climb. We both took turns to climb the pitch artificially in the same way as the first ascensionists. This gave us a chance to clean off loose rock and prepare the pitch for free climbing. It was obvious to us that the pitch would be at the limit of our ability.
Really good nuts in there.
At the end of the first day, progress has been good, and the climbers abseil back down to camp.
It's going well, that is. Tight enough anyway, isn't it?
That's not too bad.
I'll tighten it once I get onto it.
Well, you put the bag on and just jump off and swing.
Yeah.
On the third morning, the climbers make their way back up to the previous day's high point. Johnny Dawes and Paul Pritchard to Knucklehead, and Crispin Waddy and Bob Drury back onto Sidewinder.
Trying to see whether we went direct.
It takes the boys a while to perfect their individual jummering or prossicking technique, where the climber uses the jummer ratchet devices which clamp onto the rope as they take your weight. The great advantage of this technique is that the climbers can get back to the previous day's high point quickly and relatively easily. The alternative would be to bivouac out in the face itself overnight, something that most climbers would be happy to avoid. And the other big plus point of jummering is that it warms the climbers up for the day's activity ahead. The bolt belays on this stance cause some concern. They're 15 years old and they haven't been put in all that well in the first place. Paul has his first attempt at a red point. A red point style is the name given to an ascent in which the route has been worked out and practiced beforehand, and then climbed in one continuous push, placing the protection runners as you go. If the runners are pre-placed, perhaps on an abseil rope, then the ascent is known as a pink point. To imagine that one has climbed the route is called a ball point. An on-site lead allows no practice whatsoever, but the climber is allowed to be armed with detailed information of a route and may even have seen someone climb it. And a flashed ascent means that the climber has climbed the route straight off with no previous practice at all or previous knowledge of the route whatsoever. These names and styles do change from time to time, so they're not hard and fast rules.
That's close, isn't it? It's hard to hang, isn't it?
Paul's desperate for a rest, so Johnny takes over the lead, but he has little success either. The two climbers spend the rest of the day on this one problem, an exposed move graded at 6C, a grade close to the top limit of rock climbing in Britain. Paul tries a slightly different angle, more suited to his long, lanky frame, but his left handhold breaks and he comes off. Johnny goes back to the original line of attack.
Shit! Damn it!
By now, it's time to call it a day, and with the frustration and sheer fatigue, the mood has become depressingly pessimistic. The others call it a day as well, and Bobby gives the others a moment of light relief when his abseil device gets stuck in some knots in the rope. Day 4, and the frustration of the day before is still with them. Crispin is mad keen as ever, but the other three are worn down through lack of progress, and the Sròn Ulladal midges have reduced Johnny almost to tears.
Well, I mean, it might be just another dead end.
I guess we tried this.
Paul and I spent a long time cleaning and preparing the pitch, and now it's just time to enjoy a big long lead. I knew all the moves, and I knew I could do it this go if I managed to do the move above. It's quite committing when on a big lead like this you have to do one particular move, which is the key to the whole pitch. We couldn't just come back to this place again and again. So there's quite a lot of pressure on you. Although you're enjoying it, you've got to try really hard as well. It's a smooth coming up. You just got to move into a side pull.
Despite the depression of the morning, Johnny climbs over the crux at his first attempt. As Bobby jumours to his high point over in the distance, Johnny flows up the slightly easier middle section of his pitch.
This whole block here I'm on now is completely detached. It's horrendous. You could peel that whole block off and you put your foot behind it.
Got any runners on pink yet? Huh? Got any runners on pink yet? No.
The climbing becomes hard as Johnny approaches the second crux. The rock here is smooth and lacking in any kind of crack lines. On the very first aid descent, it was at this point that Terry King and Paul Lloyd use what they call their silly ring, a sling full of odd climbing paraphernalia. In times of desperation, aid climbers often used to rely on a contraption called a skyhook, which you hooked onto any minute rugosity in the rock and then pulled up on it.
Good on, John. Fucking brilliant. Hey.
Meanwhile, over to the right, Crispin and Bobby are having a hard time of it.
By now we'd got 200 foot up Sidewinder. We'd reached a band of overhangs. It made the route finding much more difficult. We decided to give up on that line and head towards the nose along a line of slabs that went that way. It was a very nice pitch, very exposed along the lip of a roof. Bob's sitting here on the magic carpet, which lost all its moss during the few days that we were there. This is the hardest part of the pitch, but fortunately it's very well protected, unlike the next part of the route.
Again. Oh, shaking.
This bit was quite loose and quite lichenous, but it was quite easy climbing on the whole. Unfortunately, the gear wasn't too good. And as I got near the nose, it became even worse. So finally I had a very frightening time at this point. We had a bit of a heated discussion over whether to continue in this direction or to go back to where we come from.
Bobby takes over the lead and pushes round onto the nose itself. The protection on this pitch has been very poor, and now it becomes even worse, heightening the tensions between the climbers.
Like, basically, go on. I'm just preparing this. Oh, you lead it then. Chris, just shut up and, just forget it, both of us.
A fall from here would unzip the whole pitch. Luckily, the other pair are close above them, and Bobby begs Johnny to bring him a vital-sized piton that he needs.
Yeah.
By this time, Paul's beginning to get worried. He's eager to go for the top, and he doesn't want to waste any time. Johnny and Paul have their own dilemma at this point. The big roofs in Knucklehead will take days of preparation in order to free climb, but they think they could reach the top by an alternative route. The rock scenery is stunning. Great, smooth grooves and corners. But there's still 3 pitches to be climbed to reach the top. Paul Pritchard.
I got myself into trouble here. I found myself unable to rest, unable to retreat. The only protection I had was an ancient sling left by egg climbers years ago. It was actually quite comical because as soon as I clipped this thing, I found this huge foothold and managed to carry on and get a belay quite easily.
Go on, Paul.
On reaching the top of the crag, the delight of success is tinged slightly with disappointment. They didn't follow exactly the route of Knucklehead as they had hoped. So although they're pretty pleased with their efforts, they're still keen to go back and tackle those top overhangs on Knucklehead, those overhangs that they think defeated them. But back down in a cave at the bottom of the crag, there's good enough reason for celebration.
No, I gotta go back. I haven't got my fit here.
Next morning, Johnny and Paul have another go at Knucklehead, but Bobby is frustrated at his lack of progress.
It's just annoying that you keep going for things, and that's the 3rd day we've been on the same belay now.
Yeah.
It's as though we'll never get away from it. We gained 250 feet really quickly, and then you just get stalled.
Meanwhile, Johnny and Paul spend their day trying to work out a very difficult sequence of moves under the big roof.
We spent a whole day taking turns trying to free climb this huge overhang.
By this time, Crispin and Bobby have returned to camp. Bobby unwinds while Crispin looks for inspiration. Next day, on the way up to the high point, which is halfway up the cliff by now, something goes wrong. On the steep grassy ramp at the base of the cliff, Bobby slips while holding a wet Juma rope in his hand. His reaction is to hold onto the rope, and this swings him out over the boulders. He falls, sustaining rope burns and facial injuries. Crispin descends, and they both go off in search of a doctor. Meanwhile, Paul, aware that there's very little he can do, carries on.
We failed to free climb the overhang, and so resorted to a single point of aid just so we could continue on the wall above. Although it's an outrageous situation to be in, after 5 days of hanging around like this, you just seem to forget about the exposure and concentrate on the next moves. We got to within 25 feet of the final overhangs.
What's it called? Luke? What happened? I had the fucking over and the lip out right. I couldn't get a single push roll.
2 days later, Bobby returns. He's been told by the doctor to go and find a dentist. But the weather is bad and the forecast is even worse. They decide to cut their losses.
That just swung right out over the boulders. Because the rope was wet, I couldn't hold it, and I started skidding down it, burning my hands.
Untie it from the white ledge. Is that right?
Yeah.
But before they can leave the crag, the climbers have to clean the rock behind them, stripping off the ropes, collecting their various runners and slings before the long walk back to the roadhead at Avansui. In the wet and windy weather, this is possibly the most serious part of the week's climbing.
How can you get to it?
Crispin has left 2 expensive pieces of protection in the crag. The gear, called Friends, cost about £50 to replace, and to leave them behind would have almost doubled the cost of his holiday. And for a climber in the Dole, that would have been unheard of. So he goes to extraordinary lengths to get them back.
That was a gripper coming down that descent, wasn't it?
You pressing that top section fast? Hey?
Jumping off on that top relay on the back road.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, do you know that pan went?
There's an air of disappointment among the climbers, with Bobby somewhat battered and a sense of failure because they didn't climb the exact route of Knucklehead. But then, there's always next year.